Hello and welcome to another episode of Captive Minds. The music for that montage was Eurovision by Laibach. And I am Shana Batterson, a polemicist and poet who writes the Red Letter Substack. And with me today is my co-host, Max Perry. Hi, Max.
Hey, Shayna, everyone. It's good to be back for another episode.
Max is an independent journalist whose work is currently syndicated with Covert Action magazine, and I suggest you check out his writing because it is very good, and he covers a lot of the topics we like to discuss here on Captive Minds. Today, we're going to cover a specific aspect of the post-World War II history of Europe, namely NATO, which is short for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And I think this discussion is relevant today. Before I give it to you, Max, to give us a more detailed account of NATO's origins, I'm just going to give a brief sketch of the historical situation at that time. So, the Allied powers had defeated the Nazi threat. The US empire thus began to turn its energies back to its real enemy, the Soviet Union. As is fairly well known, quite a few prominent American financiers had overtly or covertly supported the Nazis, and the US was willing to turn a blind eye to fascist Germany so long as it kept its gun barrels trained eastward. After the Third Reich was defeated, however, the geopolitical situation began to change. The Soviet Union, the country which had done the most to defeat the Nazis, embarked on a denazification effort in Eastern European countries, many of which had committed atrocities in collaboration with the Nazis during World War II, such as the Croatian fascist organization Ustashi, whose brutality was a little too much for the Nazis, actually, and some of the Nazi leaders even were actually horrified by what they were doing. The Western Empire needed an excuse to keep the Soviet Union from gaining a good international image as an anti-fascist country, as well as from expanding its influence in Europe, since the United States government seems to think that Europe should be its semi-colony, which it has sort of turned Europe into. Fear was whipped up of an impending Soviet invasion, which, if we look back, it's actually kind of absurd considering the Soviet leadership consistently spoke of wanting peace, as well as the fact that it would have been a very foolish political move for a country that had just lost 27 million people in war to try to take over all of Europe and incite a war with the United States. But so in 1949 at the Pentagon, NATO was formed to counter the imminent Red Menace. Max, can you tell us about the formation of NATO as well as maybe talk about Operation Gladio a bit, which we've discussed before?
Yeah, sure. I'll do my best. That was a good overview that you gave there. Well, first, I think it's important to understand that the formation of NATO and also the European Union as well, in addition to being created to counter the Soviet Union, amid the kickstarting of the Cold War, if you look at the history, it's really the alliance itself is really a realization of what the Nazis were actually hoping to create in terms of a European superstate with their expansionism. And the same applies for not just for the EU, but for NATO, as far as having an alliance against a European alliance against communism. But first, I think people need to realize that the incubation of Nazism and the keeping of Nazism on or fascism on life support after the war was over, where so many former Nazis were incorporated into the alliance's military structure and leadership. The shielding and pardoning of those war criminals is really directly related to the shift in the priorities of the West from the outset of the war's end and in NATO's formation towards combating Soviet communism in the post-World War II world. And that the shifting of those priorities, that included, making the decision to not pursue German war criminals even living in Europe and the United States or on American or European soil, not just those that escaped to far off places like South America and whatnot. And we know this thanks to the National Archives. In recent decades, starting in 1998, you had the passing of the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, which declassified and opened to the public millions of documents from the Office of Strategic Services, um, which is which was the CIA's wartime predecessor, as well as hundreds of thousands of files more from the CIA itself, as well as hundreds of thousands more from the FBI and Army intelligence files. And there was a few years later, there was a similar act in 2000, which did the same in regards to Imperial Japanese war crimes. But after the archives were opened up, there was a research group which got together, and from those disclosures in the National Archives database, they did an extensive analysis of them and published a report called U.S. Intelligence and the Nazis, which laid out how the CIA and the FBI consciously worked with Nazi war criminals, not just after the war, but even in some cases before it had even ended officially. And as the Cold War began and NATO was formed in 1949, it was clear that the pursuit of Nazi war criminals was seen as incompatible with the West's new geopolitical objectives of fighting communism and meeting the demands of the Cold War. And moreover, prosecuting those who had committed atrocities during the war is no longer a priority, which is shocking because they were even protecting, because we know about Operation Paperclip, where they gave immunity to Nazi scientists.
Didn't the Nazi scientist Werner von Braun work with Walt Disney?
Yeah, and he was very integral to NASA. I mean, they brought all kinds of people over. I mean, and that's why, in the Stanley Kubrick film, there's the Dr. Strangelove, there's the Peter Sellers Dr. Strangelove character, kind of alluding to this sort of open secret that so many Nazis were given immunity in exchange for their expertise and just absorbed into the West, into the NATO military leadership and into, various covert programs by Western intelligence agencies. But like I was saying, but they were even protecting those who they weren't recruiting into service of the U.S. at this point. I mean, it's absurd. They were deemed somehow harmless because the Axis powers had lost the war. But I mean, of course, my point is they were giving immunity not just to those who they were recruiting in exchange for their military or scientific expertise. And a famous example is, I mean, Adolf Eichmann, they did not, as far as I know, recruit him for anything, but he was living in obscurity in hiding in Argentina. And it's known, thanks to the National Archives, that the CIA and the U.S. government was aware of his location there, his hiding place in Argentina, and they did nothing to pursue him. And he was only finally apprehended in 1960 by the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, and brought to Jerusalem to be tried by an Israeli court. But his whereabouts were protected by the CIA, despite his being the supposed architect of the final solution to the Jewish question. And apparently, the U.S. government was taken by surprise when the Israelis apprehended him. But basically, Nazi war criminals, as long as they held destroying the Soviet Union as a mutual goal, they were to be considered necessary allies in the cause of the so-called free world. Um, but it's just shocking in the case of Eichmann because he wasn't even enlisted in the services of U.S. intelligence after the war, just living in hiding. Maybe they had a later use for him. I don't know. But nevertheless, they had the opportunity to take him in and deliberately chose not to because their resources were being fully directed towards fighting communism. And like I said, his apprehension took by the Israelis took the U.S. government uh, by surprise. And so the Israeli capture of Eichmann, that kind of refocused attention on all these Nazi war criminals who'd managed to elude justice in the post-war period. But it sort of was the beginning of shedding light on how so many of these people had been recruited by Western intelligence agencies in the rush to produce intelligence on the Soviets in the 50s. And some of Eichmann's associates we know had been among them. These Nazis who'd worked alongside him in exterminating millions of people in the Holocaust. So this is who the CIA chose to have a post-war relationship with as part of its clandestine struggle against the USSR. And actually, Alan Dulles, the director of the OSS, the CIA's wartime predecessor, he was a noted Nazi sympathizer, and he had engaged in controversial activities while the war was still going on, apparently with Heinrich Himmler, who apparently was it was becoming increasingly obvious to Himmler that the Axis powers were going to lose the war, and he had basically been in back channel communications with Dulles about making an anti-communist North Atlantic alliance once the war was over. He ended up committing suicide and taking cyanide when he was in the custody of the British. But even though Himmler had died, he had made attempts to form this kind of to propose this. So if you think about it, Himmler, in some ways, if you ask me, is really sort of almost the brainchild of NATO in his attempts to make at making a separate peace with the Western allies, to form an alliance against the Soviets. And the go-between in that dialogue, I mean, there's a terrific book that everybody should read that gets into this. It's called The Devil's Chessboard, Alan Dulles, the CIA, and the Rise of America's Secret Government by David Talbot. And he gets into these activities by Dulles, where the go-between in that dialogue was General Karl Wolff, who was Himmler's right-hand man in the SS, who offered Dulles in return for post-war amnesty to build an intelligence network against the Soviets. So even though Himmler committed suicide, that after the war, that is exactly what ended up taking place. Himmler wasn't involved because he was dead, but the CIA did end up integrating many fascists, including the head of the Reichsführer SS, which was the branch of Nazi intelligence focused on the USSR, namely Reinhard Gehlen, who was appointed by the CIA to head West German intelligence after the war. And he proceeded to hire many of his Nazi cohorts. And these fascists, these Nazis who were absorbed into the alliance, were also involved. I mean, you asked me to get into Operation Gladio, but long story short, the stay-behind armies that were set up that became Operation Gladio were these secret fascist paramilitaries whose, the purported objective was on the basis of serving as military forces that would stay behind in the event of a Soviet invasion and commit acts of sabotage against them. That was really that started to be set up when Galen was the head of the not just the Galen organization, but later the BND, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, which is one of my favorite things to say. But basically, if you ask me, if Himmler was kind of like the brainchild of what later became NATO, Galen was sort of the creator of what became Operation Gladio. You know, the stay behind armies that he and other former Nazi officials set up were part of this larger Western European network of clandestine fascist militias established by the CIA and NATO. And they recruited these organizations, they recruited various far right and other extreme right wing anti communists and gave them access to arms depots. And they were, they ended up committing all these false flag terrorist attacks targeting the European civilian population, which were most of which were blamed on communist organizations like Baader Meinhof Gang, the Red Brigades, and they were blamed on them in order to expand the security state and create this strategy of tension, where these countries would the civilian populations would become afraid of communism and give up more and more of their rights to this security state. And the victims of these false flag attacks were European and Western civilians, and NATO was directly behind all of it. And Nazis and fascists like Galen were involved in setting up the groups that carried them out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I had no idea about Himmler having the idea for basically NATO.
I mean, you could, I don't, maybe it's a stretch to say that he was the brainchild of NATO. I mean, but I do think that the overtures he made, this idea, I mean, the whole idea of a European superstate and this NATO alliance, I think you can sort of trace it back to the Nazis themselves. I mean, obviously, what the NATO and the European Union, what they ended up forming politically, is not the same necessarily ideologically as what the Nazis were hoping to have, with their expansionism. But I do think that there is a relationship there, and in the Devil's Chessboard, you can see how, people like Dulles, they considered communists to be the greater enemy. I mean, the Nazis they saw as they did everything they could to avoid fighting the Nazis. I mean, they tried to use Hitler against the Soviets, and they ended, only, I mean, especially the United States, they didn't enter the war until the 11th hour. And I think it was, no bombs were dropped on this country by the Germans. So, but yeah, I mean, it's known that the Dulles brothers, especially Alan Dulles, were Nazi sympathizers, and they sort of begrudgingly went against the Germans during the war. And as soon as the war was over, and even before, as David Talbot writes about, he was already making efforts to go after the Soviets because people like him considered them the greater threat.
Yeah, and Reinhard Gehlen really, for people who don't know, he was a German military and intelligence officer who was later dubbed Hitler's super spy. But he actually had a long history. He fought for Germany under the Kaiser during World War One, as well as, fighting for Nazi Germany in World War II. And his reason he surrendered to the Allies at the end of World War II so he could get, immunity from the West and not be persecuted for any war crimes. The CIA was happy to use him because he was an espionage expert, and he in 1942 was promoted to commander of the Fremd Heer Ost, which means the Foreign Armies East, which was a German intelligence organization specifically focused on the Soviet Union and penetrating that. And of course, the US Army funded the Galen organization, which Reinhard Galen built, which he staffed with a bunch of ex-Nazi officers and including officers from the Gestapo. And actually, in 1949, the CIA absorbed his group and gave them $5 million a year, presumably for their anti-Soviet intelligence projects. But it's interesting to note that in 1954, the USSR actually applied to join NATO and was, of course, rejected, which sort of, I think, showed the real intent behind the organization. The Warsaw Pact was sort of used as justification for NATO, but the Warsaw Pact was signed in 1955, so years after the formation of NATO. And even an anti-communist like George Kennan, as well as Eisenhower, acknowledged that they didn't think that the Union wanted war. So you can really see how NATO wasn't about preventing war, it was about keeping the Soviet Union in check and preventing the spread of communism or whatnot.
Yeah, well, I think even before that, I mean, the dropping of the atomic bombs really, I mean, it was not about, the US was well aware that the Japanese were going to conditionally surrender if they gave immunity to Emperor Hirohito. But I think that the US behind the scenes wanted to achieve an Allied victory without Soviet participation, and so it could demonstrate this new capability it had in order to dominate the post-war world. And it's really even not true that the bomb was the reason for the Japanese surrender. I mean, because the Soviet Union, it was really the Soviet Union declaring war on Japan when they realized that the US was going back on its pledge with the use of the atomic bomb. I mean, they knew that the Soviets knew that they had the capability, but thanks to spies that they had at Los Alamos. But when they dropped Fat Man and Little Boy, um, I mean, it gave the appearance that the bomb was what resulted in the surrender, but it was really the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in the north, which is where the Japanese military stronghold was. I mean, all the bombs, the atomic bombs did was needlessly kill hundreds of thousands of civilians. And from that outset, after the war was over, I mean, Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech. I mean, it was very obvious that the U.S. was and the Western European countries, Great Britain, they were looking to kickstart the Cold War, and that they saw the Soviets as the greater threat to their hegemony, and they were willing to partner with former Nazis to do it.
Yeah. And another thing that I think really tied Europe to the United States and extended the US's influence was the Marshall Plan, whereby the US post World War II injected massive amounts of money into countries like France. Um, in this book, Neo-Capitalism According to Michel Cluscard, Marc Monville does a good job of laying out the effects of the Marshall Plan on French society, which is something that Cluscard, who was, alive at that time, wrote a lot about. And he sort of talked about the way it was, at least you could say it was creating the labor aristocracy within the imperial core for sure, as well as, extending US hegemony and bringing Americanization to Europe. Do you want to talk about the Marshall Plan at all?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the Marshall Plan at the end of the day was really a tool of American imperialism designed to solidify its influence in Western Europe on the basis of preventing the spread of communism. it was not some purely humanitarian effort as it was portrayed during the Cold War, to help rebuild Europe from the devastation of the war. And of course, it did have positive effects as far as economic recovery for Europe, which was devastated by the battle that took place on its territory. But it served primarily to really strengthen U.S. dominance of the global capitalist system, uh, and in the European continent, because the U.S. had emerged as the new global superpower. I mean, Britain for about, you know, a decade after sort of tried to preserve what was left of its empire, but really by the end of the 50s, it was not what it was prior to the war, certainly. And the European Recovery Program was really a manifestation of American global hegemony and a means to expand uh, Washington's economic and military might and influence. And the aid and recovery that they gave was presented as this benevolent program to rebuild Europe and its infrastructure, but it was really for the purpose of securing the U.S. foothold in the European market and more specifically, to counter any other alternative economic models that might arise. I mean, after the war, in Greece and Italy, you had, in various other places, you had significant, I mean, the communists had played a huge role in the anti-fascist war effort, and there was a possibility in places like Greece and Italy that the communists, I mean, in certain places they did take power, and the U.S. Openly meddled to stop that. And Turkey as well. I mean, they were. This is why NATO was formed, to really counter that, and the Marshall Plan was also part of this, and part of that was helping to rebuild the continent, but in a way that was self-serving to the Americans, and so they could impose their will. And I think the U.S. knew that if it didn't address the economic hardship in Europe after the war, that communism would make political gains and come to power in these various countries. And so it really solidified the interconnected relationship between Europe and the U.S. Domestically here in this country, Henry Wallace, who had been replaced by Truman during the Roosevelt administration. I mean, he was really kind of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party previously, and was, integral to the New Deal. He was ousted basically in a coup by the conservative Southern Democrats. But he ended up running for president in 1948 on the Progressive Party ticket, and he opposed the Marshall Plan. At least he thought it should have been implemented through the United Nations, and he opposed it as this Cold War policy that was clearly designed to lay the foundations for a confrontation between the U.S. and the USSR. And he was totally right, because it was done in tandem with the Truman Doctrine, which was this military lend-lease program, which really started the whole thing of the U.S. just appointing itself to be the world's policeman and, a self-appointed global leader. And in the process, these European countries, through accepting this aid, really gave up their sovereignty and independence, and they're under most of them are under occupation to this day. I mean, Italy is like a virtual American aircraft carrier. Same thing for Germany, and it really made these countries beholden to the United States. There have been some periods where there's been resistance to that. I mean, most famously in the mid 60s in France under de Gaulle, they withdrew from NATO's integrated military command. I think that they stayed still officially a member, but and that was because of several factors. I mean, France really desired to have greater sovereignty and control over its own military, and to have, something resembling an independent European defense. And there was disagreements with the U.S. over nuclear strategy and leadership. Um, and apparently De Gaulle, I mean, it's it's unproven, but De Gaulle apparently thought that the CIA was involved in a coup attempt against him, which, if you look at it, it's possible that it was intertwined with Operation Gladio, because there was this group called the OAS, which was the Organisation de l'Armée Secrète, like the secret army organization, basically is what it translates to, which was this far right French paramilitary group that was part of Operation Gladio, and it was very much opposed to decolonization of Algeria or Algerian independence. And the OAS attempted to assassinate De Gaulle several times. Actually, that became the inspiration for the film Day of the Jackal, which came out in the 70s. I'm not sure entirely if the CIA was ever proven to be involved, but nevertheless, de Gaulle believed they were involved with those attempts on his life. And but we do know for sure that the OAS was one of the groups that were part of the Gladio network. So, and there have been, I mean, unfortunately, France later ended up re-entering NATO after the War on Terror began. France has always sort of been kind of the outlier, and unfortunately, like in 2011, they were one of the leading countries, if not the leading country in the NATO assault on Libya, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, there have been periods of, I mean, there have been indications recently even where Emmanuel Macron has tried to, for self-serving reasons and to counter his political opponents, because there's so much anti-NATO sentiment in Europe, in France, where he made remarks like that NATO was brain dead, I think is what he said, seemingly alluding to like the possibility that could happen again. I mean, with the whole rise of all these right-wing populist parties, there's been a real threat of many of these countries leaving not just the European Union, but also NATO. I don't think that a lot of these right-wing populists are really sincere about that. I mean, people like Meloni in Italy are very pro-NATO and whatnot. So they're seemingly willing to change their position on that when it's politically opportune. But nevertheless, within these countries, in Germany, which is, all these countries have been Germany's been occupied for over 75 years. I mean, that's how long ago the war was, and yet they remain under, they remain these NATO military fortified bases, basically, this bulwark against Russia. So, but that's what the Marshall Plan did, and it still has, this strong, it still represents how America was able to solidify its dominance over the continent, which remains to this day.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how if we look back, a lot of things today are actually were products of either trying to look good in comparison to the Soviet Union or just part of the general fight against communism. Like the whole New Deal under Roosevelt was to sort of, was granting concessions to the workers' movement and to make the US look better. And as since the fall of the Soviet Union, we've seen that sort of just the US emperor gone on a rampage because it doesn't need to keep up an image for its own populations. I mean, now we've got like the infrastructure in the US is just going down the tubes and all that. But then another thing that arose from the fight against communism was the internet, which was sort of the whole sort of idea for it was incubated during the Vietnam War to better collect data on the Viet Cong fighters because since they knew the jungle, they were out maneuvering US troops that were stationed there. I just think it's interesting that these things we sort of take for granted are a product of that conflict. And speaking of the more overt strategies after the fall of the Soviet Union, that's around the time when the whole NATO bombing campaign against Yugoslavia occurred, which I think we should talk about because that was, I mean, they were using all sorts of bombs, cluster bombs, and totally destroying the country.
Well, yeah, I mean, not just I mean, also used depleted uranium, which um, left Serbia uh, to this day with the highest cancer rate in all of Europe. Yeah, I mean, the lead up to that, I mean, Yugoslavia had been actually a non-aligned country during the Cold War, so it was exempt from a lot of the economic warfare that a lot of other communist countries were subject to. So it was actually a relatively successful example of an example of a relatively successful socialist state, and as far as like what it can achieve when it's not undermined by more powerful capitalist countries. And whatever anyone wants to say about the break between Tito and Stalin, I mean, Tito was really uh, an amazing figure. I mean, he led one of the most heroic resistances in the war against fascism, with the partisans, and the Yugoslavia, for all its faults, I mean, it was able to, despite the fact that they had one of the worst examples of the Holocaust take place there, where fellow countrymen, I mean, significant sections of the population, both Croatian and Muslim, Albanian and Bosnian, sided with the Nazi occupiers and killed in extremely brutal ways. I mean, as you said earlier, even the Nazis were somewhat repelled by the extent of the savagery. Despite the fact that they had this incredibly grisly and tragic chapter, after the war was over, they were able to form this federation state that where they mostly lived harmoniously for several decades. I mean, Tito, I mean, it's said that he favored certain groups over others. I mean, he was a Croat himself. So there was some ethnic tensions that were sort of built in there, and sort of waiting to come to the surface once the breakup of the Yugoslavia happened. But if you look at what caused the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, it really, even though it was a non-aligned country and it uh, was relatively successful, it really started in the 1980s when there was, I mean, after Tito's death, there was um, a lot of austerity programs that were introduced, and it really, historically, if you look at like even in Weimar Germany, for example, the privatization of state-run industry and the gutting of social welfare programs and you know, economic shock therapy that really contributes to uh, all kinds of uh, significant problems as far as the social fabric goes. And it really also, you had the West, not just in Yugoslavia, but in former communist countries, period, they were really encouraging nationalist independence movements. And so just as Yugoslavia was getting all these IMF loans after Tito's death, which imposed, austerity measures and contributed to massive unemployment and, collapsed the Communist Party. It fueled the nationalism that subsequently happened in the decades that follow. There's a great series of documentaries called The Weight of Chains that get into all this. And of course, Michael Parenti wrote To Kill a Nation, which is a great book. Diana Johnstone has done great work on this subject. Edward S. Herman, John Pilger, many more people. But basically what ended up happening was, Yugoslavia, which was formed out of, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, and Montenegro, and what's now called North Macedonia. But Macedonia, basically because all these ethnicities and national communities during Yugoslavia were all intermingled, when the nationalist independence movements were encouraged, they all started trying to form various quasi-states within one another and claiming rights to different territories. I mean, you had Serbs within Croatia, Croatians within Serbia, and vice versa. Bosnians, you had Serbs in Bosnia forming the Republika Srpska. You had Krajina in Croatia, and so on and so forth. And so basically, you had this kickstarted various campaigns of ethnic cleansing and ethno-nationalism. At a certain point, the West singled out the Serbs as the villains in the whole conflict, even though there was ethnic cleansing taking place on all sides. In fact, probably more so on the Bosnian and Croatian front.
Yeah, I'm just going to interject really quickly. We can see historically the United States has a very hypocritical or contradictory take on nationalism, because when it is advantageous, like when there are any sort of unions of countries that perhaps wouldn't just go along with what the United States wants, then it likes to stoke ethnic tensions and encourage nationalism. But conversely, when authentic nationalist movements arise that are maybe more anti-imperialist, the United States wants to quash that. So I think it's important, people to distinguish between different types of nationalism.
Yeah, I mean there was a significant Serbian nationalist movement. I mean, again, a lot of this stuff goes back to the Second World War, and if you look at the nationalist movements that arose in the 1990s in Yugoslavia, a lot of them ideologically, I mean, some of them, not only were they trying to carve out territories that they had hoped that they had emulated, like for example, the Albanian separatists in Kosovo, which was historically a part of Serbia. They were replicating Mussolini and the Greater Albania project that the fascists there had tried to carve out. I mean, it was very much inspired by that. And some of these people were even former Nazis themselves. I mean, in the president of Bosnia Herzegovina, Alija Izetbegovic, he had actually served in the SS during the Second World War. He was a literal Nazi. And he was being welcomed to the White House by Bill Clinton. I mean, this was not any secret. I mean, the Tudjman, the head of Croatia, he wrote in his autobiography. I mean, he was a flat out Holocaust denier. This is who the U.S. was supporting uh, against the Serbs. And yes, there were war crimes committed by specifically the Bosnian Serbs, but they were greatly exaggerated. Some of them may have even been done by the Bosnians themselves. I mean, there was all kinds of dubious circumstances around the Srebrenica massacre, which is really what the U.S. or NATO, excuse me, used as an excuse to directly intervene in the conflict with its bombing campaigns. And as we mentioned on previous podcasts, I mean, on terrorism, I mean, there was a huge presence both in Bosnia and Kosovo of foreign mujahideen fighters. I mean, Al Qaeda was very much involved there. And in fact, in Bosnia, two of the 9/11 hijackers, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, who actually were staying in my hometown of San Diego in the lead up to the 9/11 attacks, and were, getting help from a Saudi intelligence officer. They had fought in Bosnia in the mid 90s. That's where they cut their teeth as jihadists. And apparently, just a few years later, helped hijack a plane and that they supposedly slammed into the Pentagon, even though the U.S. was supporting the Bosnian Mujahideen. So, but yeah, NATO conducted massive air campaigns. This was, I mean, the Serbs were historically aligned with Russia. This even pissed off the Yeltsin administration, which was totally subservient to the U.S., but it became a big issue for them because Russians were, of course, furious about what the United States was doing to their Serbian brothers. And this breakup of the former Yugoslavia. I mean, the other reason that the Serbs were targeted was because, first of all, I mean, their state was semi-socialist, and Milosevic really wanted to, in addition to having a Serbian state, he wanted to preserve what was left of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, but that was not to be. The Western European powers and the United States wanted to completely carve up the Federation and so it could have its way economically. And this was really NATO sending a message to the world about its full spectrum dominance and the fact that the U.S. was the big global superpower now. The Cold War was over, and if you didn't go along with what they wanted to do, you were going to end up like Milosevic, who was later ousted in a color revolution, and then put in this kangaroo court, this star chamber of this ad hoc tribunal that was formed, the ICTY, and died under various very mysterious circumstances. And actually, it's funny, even though he was charged with all these war crimes, he was posthumously acquitted. There was no direct line between whatever war crimes or atrocities that were committed by the Bosnian Serbs and Belgrade. And, whatever took place was not under Milosevic's orders. He was singled out for regime change, but he was posthumously acquitted. And if you tell people this now, most people aren't even aware of that. I mean, it's just assumed that he was guilty because he died while in custody. But
in Michael Prunty's book, does a good job of laying out how the mainstream media sort of manufactured a lot of the atrocities which were used to justify the humanitarian intervention. And with the US empire, which has a history of like funding death squads and terrorists and all these things, there's often this imperial projection that anything that's, whether fighting against that or is just inconvenient to the United States, is that, and it's oftentimes manufactured. And if we move forward, to NATO's bombing of Libya, which is another humanitarian intervention, it Libya was much worse after the bombing than before under Gaddafi. You can was the I mean, it really devastated the country.
Yeah, I mean, to this day, it's a failed state. Yeah, I mean, I mean, I mean, it became a civil war, but I really think at least not in the beginning. I mean, it was really a proxy war. I mean, they say that, I mean, it's been a while since I read about this, but I mean, I followed what was happening in Libya at the time, and there were these Arab Spring protests that, of course, started in Egypt and Tunisia, and actually, what the Arab Spring protests that started in Libya, I believe it was like immediately after Ben Ali had to flee Tunisia. And this wave of protests in the region spread to Libya. And supposedly the grievances of the protesters were over, I guess, delays in public housing developments. But really under Gaddafi, for all his faults, Libya was one of the most, if not the most economically prosperous countries, not just in North Africa, but Africa as a whole. I mean, most housing was covered by the state, and actually, I mean, despite condemning the rallies, Gaddafi did acknowledge the problem and the grievances of the protesters. But immediately, I mean, Western media, the U.S. government, they started creating this scenario that there was going to be this uh, humanitarian crisis and this imminent massacre. Um, but it was complete propaganda that we know. Um, and as I was saying, compared to less developed countries in the region, the Middle East and North Africa, the Libyan standard of living was much higher in terms of life expectancy, education, healthcare. Uh, and as far as the real motivations for NATO's intervention, they say that Gaddafi was planning on introducing a gold-backed uh, Pan-African dinar currency for the whole continent and was planning to drop the US dollar as a reserve currency. I mean, some of Hillary Clinton's emails that were released by WikiLeaks allude to that. I mean, she was Secretary of State under Obama and was the one who spearheaded the whole NATO intervention. And of course, oil was also a major motivating factor. I mean, that the assault on Libya destroyed Libya's oil industry. But anyway, so after these protests started in early 2011, the United Nations, they adopted this resolution which imposed a no-fly zone, which was ostensibly to protect civilians, but really gave the green light for NATO to launch its campaign, which became the catalyst for the civil war that ensued. And the bombing campaign actually was done in total violation of the War Powers Act, just like what Clinton did in Yugoslavia. He did not, I mean, George W. Bush, fucking war criminal. But you know what? To go to war in Iraq, he went to Congress and got authorization. I mean, of course, it's horrible that they gave it to him, but Obama didn't even do that. I mean, this campaign was done in total. There was no authorization from Congress sought before launching this illegal war. And the airstrikes hit all kinds of civilian infrastructure, hospitals, civilian targets. And like I was saying earlier, there was all kinds of outrageous war propaganda spread in Western newspapers that like Gaddafi was like giving out anti-impotency drugs and Viagra to his troops and ordering them to go out and commit mass rapes. I mean, just
It's
total.
always it's always mass rapes is like always the one that's used, but then actual cases of like, for example, with the IDF and rape is never talked about. in the
Hmm.
mainstream media.
Yeah, I mean, there was a similar thing about even the Red Army in World War II. There's a lot of course, in all war, there are documented cases of, in the period of lawlessness, every army, I'm sure you could find, I mean, of rapes having occurred. And I'm sure the Red Army, there was some, but like, there's like this historical trope that like the Soviet Army was like this committing these mass rapes that has been shown over and over again to be exaggerated.
Yeah, I think Solzhenitsyn wrote poems sort of promoting that about the mass rapes.
It would not surprise me.
Yeah, I can't remember, or maybe it was a story. I can't remember what the it was called, but he had something. But
Interesting you would write a poem about that kind of subject, though. It's not very
no, but I think it's, because yeah, that rapes are sort of what happens during a war. And it's like it's different when you have soldiers committing rapes, that's bad, but it's not the same as like policies of mass rapes. Just always what it's made out to seem like there's somehow some sanctioned policy of rape or who knows what. But in regards to the bombing of Libya, I think that if anything, like should tell you that NATO is just about being an imperialist disciplinary organization, it's that because if it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, why would it be bombing Libya if it was just, about the North Atlantic?
yeah, I mean it's absurd. I mean Libya is nowhere near there. I mean, yeah, it's really just I mean, the US is who presides over NATO. That's who it's beholden to. And the irony was that that Gaddafi was always accused of being a sponsor of terrorism. They say supposedly he was behind the Lockerbie bombing, Pan Am Flight 103 in the 80s. But it's always been questionable whether he had anything to do with that. And NATO intervened on the side of actual terrorists that had all kinds of links to Al Qaeda, these Islamist rebels that, in the arms they sent ended up in the hands of Islamist militias like the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. And Al Qaeda proceeded to overrun the country, which descended into lawlessness and chaos. And eventually, Gaddafi was apprehended and he was sodomized with a bayonet. Um, upon which Hillary Clinton was in an interview, she laughed and said, "We came, we saw, he died." Um, so it's law and order was not brought to the country. I mean, it became a failed state. To this day, there's multiple competing governments run by feuding warlords. You've got black migrants being sold in open slave markets. I mean, it's ranked in as one of the worst countries in the world in terms of internal conflict and instability since Gaddafi was overthrown. So whatever anyone wants to say about him, I mean, he had been a longtime supporter of the Palestinian cause. He had supported the anti-apartheid struggle and remained on good terms with Nelson Mandela until his death. And the CIA had already pre-selected the leader to succeed him. This longtime CIA asset, this warlord by the name of Khalid Haftar, who had actually been part of the Libyan army under Gaddafi after the king was ousted in the late 60s. And I guess what happened was Libya had been at war with Chad in the 1980s, and this guy Haftar was captured as a prisoner of war. And I guess at that point he went rogue and he was recruited by the CIA to be this asset. I guess he felt like Gaddafi deserted him or something. So when NATO bombed Libya, they basically installed him as their puppet ruler. And the country's been left in ruins. And actually, in 2012, the country was so lawless, that and under the control of terrorist groups, that some of them, this one militia even attacked the U.S. embassy and ended up killing the U.S. ambassador to Libya, which became a big scandal for Hillary Clinton because she, it was said that neglected warnings about the lead up to that attack on the consulate. According to Seymour Hersh, that consulate was actually a cover for where arms were supposedly being sent to the rebels in Syria. He wrote an article at the time, I remember, called "The Red Line and the Rat Line," which is a pretty shocking article, what it alleges. But basically, Libya became a failed state, overtaken by tribal militias and rival warlords, thanks to NATO, and caused hundreds of thousands to flee in what is probably the worst refugee crisis since the Second World War. And a lot of people also forget that prior to the war, Gaddafi, after the war on terror was launched, Gaddafi did this about face where I mean, in hindsight, it was a totally stupid move. But he agreed to give up any nuclear ambitions and disarm. And he handed over the suspects in the Lockerbie bombing. And he was welcomed back basically into the so-called international community. I mean, he even came to the UN in 2009 and spoke, which was awesome because he took the opportunity to say that Bush should be arrested for crimes against humanity.
Yeah, at that same time, he also said, quote, they will engineer viruses and release them in public so the capitalist drug manufacturers can profit from making vaccines. It's just a business for them. Just is pretty funny.
I mean,
And
I've always had Gaddafi. I mean, the guy had a squad of all-female bodyguards. I mean, he was the most flamboyant dictator. I mean, he looked like if Michael Jackson decided to become a dictator. I mean, there's something about Gaddafi that I always found kind of charming. I mean, I know that, yes, there was a lot of repression in Libya, but I mean, the real reason he was an enemy was because he was a secular Arab nationalist. He supported the Palestinians. And there were many progressive things about him, especially compared to other countries in that part of the world. I make no bones about saying that. So,
people wonder why the world's in such a bad state. But if you look, like the United States has prevented other countries from actually progressing just for so many years and sort of throwing them back into the dark ages.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, their mission was on humanitarian grounds, but look at what they turned Libya into. And what happened to Gaddafi is really a lesson to be learned by any country out there that's been targeted by Washington. I mean, Iran and North Korea certainly don't want to make that same mistake. I did want to talk a little bit more about, some of the Nazis that NATO incorporated into its military structure, because there were a few people that we didn't mention. We talked about Reinhard Gehlen, who was chief of the Wehrmacht Foreign Army's Eastern Military Intelligence Service. And after the war, he led the Gehlen Organization, which was this CIA-backed surveillance apparatus. And then that became the BND, which Gehlen founded. And it's very contradictory because the whole reason that Germany was kept on a short leash was supposedly because of the crimes that the Nazis had committed during the war, but to the point where they were occupied by the British, French, and the Americans. But at the same time, NATO recruits. I mean, that was the reason that they were kept on a short leash, but then they turn around and they recruit this high-ranking former Nazi to be at the head of its security and intelligence agency. And the occupation of West Germany only ended once Germany agreed to join NATO in the mid 50s. And then they were allowed to rearm and have a fighting force up to 500,000 men. But it was basically only after Bonn agreed to seal its fate with the rest of the alliance countries in this standoff that lasted until the end of the Cold War that they were given any amount of sovereignty. So really, Germany wasn't, its self-determination was not being held back because of any of the atrocities that the Nazis committed. Because as time and time again showed, the CIA and NATO were willing and eager to pardon all these war criminals. And Germany was being used as a beachhead against the USSR. And all these countries, all these European countries had to basically prostrate themselves in subservience while actual Nazis were given privileged treatment. And many of them had been members of the intelligence services of the SS and the Nazi Party, the Gestapo, the Waffen SS. They were all recruited into the Gehlen organization. And although they weren't necessarily recruited at the instruction of the US government, they knew that he was doing that and they did nothing about it. And some of the most high-ranking Nazi officials that were part of the West German military personnel and NATO's leadership were Hans Spiedel and Adolf Heisinger, who were the first two lieutenant generals of the West German Armed Forces. And Hans Spiedel later became commander of the Allied Land Forces Central Command in NATO. And he actually served as one of Konrad Adenauer's key military advisors. Konrad Adenauer was the first chancellor of West Germany. And actually, if you look at his history, he'd been imprisoned during Nazi Germany during the Night of the Long Knives. But in order to still get his pension, he wrote like this letter to Hermann Goering saying, "Oh, when I was the mayor of Cologne, I allowed Nazi flags to fly from city flagpoles. I allowed the Nazis to have their rallies. I gave them all kinds of perks in defiance of Prussian law at the time, in order so he could still get his pension." And this is the guy who was the first leader of West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany after the war was over. And he was one of the people who lobbied the Allies to free most of the Wehrmacht war criminals in their custody and bring them into his cabinet, including one of the authors of the Nuremberg race laws. Hans Globke was his name. But also Adolf Heisinger, he later became chairman of the NATO Military Committee and was also part of the Gehlen organization, was even at one point considered to be Gehlen's replacement. So the extent to which all these former Nazis were brought into NATO was extensive. And this whole reason for NATO still occupying Germany to this day, that these war crimes that the Nazis committed, that was never what it was about, because they were giving all these privileged leadership positions and amnesty to all these well-documented war criminals.
That's pretty crazy. And we can see that the whole justification for NATO, which was fighting and you're preparing for communist invasion, was totally false, because since the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO's done nothing but expand. And NATO's eastward expansion is at least some of the reason for the Russia-Ukraine war. Putin was saying, don't expand, don't come any further east. So what does NATO do? Go further east, start amassing troops, sending on the border. And also, of course, then there is the actual high level of Nazis in Ukraine, which is not ex exaggerated.
Yeah, those are both important points you just made because, well, first of all, there was an agreement between the administration of Bush Senior, Secretary of State James Baker, and Gorbachev that after Germany reunified, that NATO would not expand to the east. So they've gone back on that pledge. And you mentioned that the Soviet Union applied to join NATO in the mid 50s and was rebuffed. I mean, the same thing happened with Russia. Um, they they had hoped to, I mean, very naively, hoped to become part of the alliance, but of course the eastward expansion was always about encircling Russia. I mean, they really, a lot of the Anglo-American Atlanticist political elite, Dick Cheney, Zbigniew Brzezinski, they talked about how they really wanted to carve up and balkanize Russia ultimately. And yeah, it's absolutely been the catalyst for the Ukraine war. And you know, NATO is really once the Cold War ended, became an obsolete organization, and it's had to come up with these new scenarios to justify its continued existence. For in the 90s, it was the former Yugoslavia, and ever since then, it's been making Russia out to be an enemy because it would have no reason to exist otherwise. And the most absurd thing is that Russia is capitalist. It's not a socialist country, so there's no communism to contain, and yet still that's not enough. I mean, yeah, that's absolutely been one of the major factors in the Russia-Ukraine war and throughout the Cold War. The U.S. or the CIA, kept Ukrainian nationalism that had been aligned with the Nazis during World War II. They kept that on life support. The CIA supported an insurgency in Ukraine against the Soviets that was made up of these ultra nationalists from World War II, the Stepan Bandera's organization. And then when the Soviet Union began to break apart, Ukrainian nationalism saw a resurgence and now is a very significant political force in Ukraine. And you have neo-Nazi organizations playing a big role in the regime change that ended up happening there in Maidan in 2014. And that's been a big factor in the Russia-Ukraine conflict as well. So, yeah, I mean, NATO, I mean, whatever you want to call the acronym, the North Atlantic Fascist Organization, the Nazi Atlantic Terrorist Organization, they're all applicable because that's really what NATO, its history has been. And it's so absurd, like these recent protests talking about hands off NATO, those hands off protests. I mean, it's just so anyone who has any knowledge of the history of NATO, I mean, it's so laughable, like the way that people are totally ignorant about its history. And, I'm certainly no fan of Donald Trump, but the uh, rift that has occurred as far as like, Trump seemingly suggesting that NATO countries should have to pay more for their protection and all that. I mean, if there's any sort of silver lining to this administration, I certainly hope it is the breakup of NATO. And it certainly seems like uh, the European citizenry are starting to realize that their sovereignty has been sacrificed to U.S. interests. I mean, the Russia-Ukraine war, where I mean, look at the damage it's done to the European economy, forcing them to go along with this proxy war. Countries like Germany have basically committed economic suicide going along with it, while the U.S. has blown up their their pipeline project that they had with Russia. Um, so hopefully there is a imminent breakup of NATO in the years to come, because throughout its entire existence, it's done nothing but cause devastation and around the world. And yeah, I think that that is seemingly on the horizon,
Yeah,
the immediate future.
I certainly hope so. I do know. I think apparently, I think a few years ago, Mike Pompeo said that he thought Taiwan should join NATO because, I very, very much trying to, the stage is trying to be set to have a proxy war with China via Taiwan.
They
Just,
were even suggesting there was even talk like under Trump about Jair Bolsonaro, like when he was in office, like Brazil joining NATO, which is completely absurd. I mean, it's in South America. I mean, and for all his talk, I mean, Trump in his years in office acceded two countries to NATO. I believe it was Montenegro and North Macedonia. Um, so he went back on that pledge in his first term. I mean, yes, the Ukraine war under Biden saw countries that had been neutral for decades, like Sweden, these Scandinavian countries join NATO, which is very disturbing. But we'll see if Trump is really going to commit to this anti-NATO pledge. I remain skeptical.
well, we should be wrapping up, and do you have any final thoughts?
No, that's basically it. I think we covered a lot of the history. I mean, we'll post links. There's a good documentary about Reinhard Gehlen called Hitler's Super Spy. There's lots of great resources about Yugoslavia. Like I said, the weight of chains, excuse me. There's a whole series of films made by this Serbian filmmaker, Boris Malagurski. There's numerous other documentaries, Sarajevo Ricochet. Uh, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of Diana Johnstone has a great book. Um, Michael Parenti's Kill a Nation. Um, yeah, we'll post links to lots of stuff. Also, remember to like and follow our YouTube channel. Subscribe to our Substack. Please leave comments and any feedback. If we got anything wrong, please feel free to correct me. Or us, I should say. Yeah, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and we'd love to hear from you. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Captive Minds.
Yes, thank you for listening.